Okay, good morning. Good to see everybody. So I'm just going to introduce our panel. I'm just going to say their names and, read
Their
off.
bios are in
Yeah.
If you scan the program, their bios are in.
Yeah, so that's why I said I'm not going to read their bios. I'm just going to introduce them and their papers. And I just encourage you as the speakers are talking, if you want to write down questions, we'll have Q&A. And yeah, if you write down your questions, that might help Q&A go faster. That way more people can have an opportunity to engage with the panel. So first we will have Dr. I'm always calling everybody doctor. Let's just say in the future Dr. Cecile Lopez. I'm making her a doctor. Cecile Lopez, who's gonna go first, down with Uptown, analysis of migratory dispossessions. Our own Dr. Angela Mack, Hurricane Katrina, migration rhetorics and compositions of Black folks in natural disaster. Abdul Isaac will follow No Africans Involved, contextualizing the Western imperialist project from an Afrocentric abolitionist perspective. Sounds like that's gonna be right up my alley. And then last but not least, Suzanne Nemo, like the fish, imagine kinship on Caribbean plantations, literary depictions of Black feminist care. So I will pass you. Are y'all gonna use this? Is this one on?
Yes, it's clicker. It's on for.
Okay, it's on, the clicker's on, and then if you prefer the hand mic, just let me know.
Yes.
Hello. So, yes, the future doctor, I will be eventually, right, a professor. So y'all will see me be teaching a lot. Hopefully, if you keep coming to these, to more of these. But anyways, hi, I'm Cecile. I'm presenting Down with Uptown. I'm sorry I'm looking down. I also have the presentation on my phone just to make it a little easier for me and so that I don't give myself a creak in the neck. So, yep. This is an analysis of migratory dispositions in the little neighborhood called Little Mexico in Dallas, Texas. Specifically, this research is conducting an analysis of the neighborhood now called Uptown. Everyone knows Uptown as the social slang of the neighborhood with trendy restaurants, a lot of cool bars, nightlife, what is it, those little scooters, the Lime scooters, and everything in between, right? Sephora, all these cool, trendy things. However, there used to be a Mexican working class population there, not too long ago, actually. And the fact that most people have forgotten about it too is such a terrible thing to even say. To understand this preliminary study, I had engaged in analysis of visual maps from the past and the present, and then also seeing the environmental aspects of it, the different types of businesses that are in the area, different types of housing, and so on. The argument that I have made is that this gentrification that happened in the area is modern genocide, especially because, again, the people that have unfortunately had to move, and unfortunately some of them passed away and everything, but again, it's because of the businesses, the culture being eliminated, and a specific member named Charlie Villasana, and he was fortunately passed away recently, but he also was one of the members of the community that had been erased with Uptown coming in. I give some definitions of gentrification for those who may not know. Again, Little Mexico neighborhood, it started in 1870s, but it was officially established and on the Dallas census map in 1910. Oak Cliff, we all know Oak Cliff for those who live here, is a new neighborhood in the south of I-30 and I-35. And again, it is a predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhood, and most of the Little Mexico members actually moved to Oak Cliff. And then the Mexican Revolution began in 1910, and it was actually the catalyst of what caused Mexican migrants to move into that area that was called Little Mexico. So I have a couple of visuals, because again, I talk a lot about maps. So Little Mexico neighborhood, as you can see, the black and white map, and these red blocks-ish type of things. The one that kind of looks like a blockish Pac-Man, that's where Little Mexico is, or it was also called El Barrio. And all the other ones are also Mexican neighborhoods, but today we're talking only about Little Mexico. And then we can see on the other map that it is Uptown, the new neighborhood with trendy restaurants, luxury apartments, a lot of parking lots, and the buildings. It's especially Again, it was starting the Uptown neighborhood in the 1980s, but it was officially on the Dallas map a lot smaller than it is now in 1998. And now we're gonna do a little visual of what Oak Cliff is. Everyone sees where the D and the A is. That's where Little Mexico was, a little speck, a little dot. And now we can see where Oak Cliff is, and it is significantly a lot more south. And then not to mention too, it's a topic for another day, but Bishop Arts is now eating away Oak Cliff. So for a little bit of context, the Dallas neighborhood, again known as Uptown right now to most, and Little Mexico to very few, has received an overwhelming amount of popularity. The neighborhood is filled with new trendy restaurants, expensive clothing stores, and tall office buildings. You can see the before and after pic, and it's actually the same street. So that's I believe Clybourne Park, and the neighborhood that it was established in 1910, so that we can see the before and after of the highways, roads, again office buildings, and housing. However, we don't know the effects of these new businesses that happen in the area. We just know, right, a before and after picture, and so I'm here to dissect that a little bit today. The popularity of the restaurants or the new highways that take up all of DFW are what caused this change. The people only come to Uptown for its reputation of shopping, working in the offices, or nightlife. There used to be a living community that enriched Dallas with the Mexican culture and customs. By comparing the maps that I had, like I said before, right, and throughout history and documentaries, we will see that Uptown hasn't always been a place for business. These old Dallas maps, history books, and documentaries will show that Dallas has changed significantly. And the drastic change in Dallas is well documented on the Dallas census maps too, which I think is very important. So it's not a lie, right? A lot of documentation to say of the neighborhoods. And I wanted to provide a specific timeline too. So the Mexican Revolution began in 1910, which again caused the Mexican migrants to move to the United States and specifically to the Little Mexico area. And it was officially established and in the Dallas census in 1910. Does everybody know the El Phoenix restaurant? Right? It actually started in Little Mexico, and it was actually named something else before, but it started in Little Mexico in 1918. And then the Charlie Villasana grocery store, he's the last living member that passed away recently in 2018 of Little Mexico. It started in 1932 by his father. So then we have the major highways that were built in Dallas. I hope all of us are a little educated on how highways divide us instead of make it easy transportation. And then in the 1960s, that's when the neighborhood had peaked. There was also the Santos Rodriguez. Unfortunately, he was a little boy, a 12-year-old boy who was shot by the police and was caused with police brutality. So that was another reason why it was the start of the decline of the community, like the neighborhood, because there was a lot of police brutality. Juan Crow laws obviously still existed during this time, and then also Mexican lynching as well. The decline of the Little Mexico population in the 1980s. Uptown was officially established on the census, and then Charlie Villasana passed away in 2018. He was the last living member of Little Mexico that still lived in Little Mexico area. This is the census that they had, or like the official document that they had from Dallas, and it has all the list of the businesses, the barber shops, like the grocery stores, the salons, all sorts of things. And I thought it was actually a pretty cool piece of evidence to use for this research. Okay. For my findings, I have found that Uptown doesn't have locally owned grocery stores, affordable housing, cultural events, or a community. Uptown now is filled with expensive high-end restaurants and cafes, Starbucks, yoga studios, Whole Foods, Sephora, and the list goes on and on. Uptown has completely erased what was known as Little Mexico. The only thing that's there is Pike Park. That's the only thing, and now they added the Santos Rodriguez statue recently last year, but again, that's not enough for our community. And obviously, we have all been displaced. Little Mexico was a place of community by the Mexican immigration population of 1870s, and I say up until 2018 to respect Charlie Villasana, when the last living resident and grocery store owner had passed away. This is some of the evidence I use. The Pedro Hernández grocery store is now the parking lot in front of the Perot Museum. The grocery store is right behind the little boy, and I guess when people are looking at it, it's behind him on the left. That's the grocery store. And the Todo Tortilla factory closed a long time ago, but it had been replaced with these luxury apartments that started at $1,600, and that number, I believe, is from like 2018, 2020, so I'm not surprised if it's $2,000 as the cheapest apartment there. The Luna Tortilla factory closed more recently. In 2021, it was a tortilla factory and also a restaurant. And now there is a trophy chest sports bar there. So we can obviously see the differences very there. And the Rodolfo Villasana grocery store. It was founded in 1932 by the father of Charlie Villasana, and it had to shut down because, again, there was no homes anymore. There was a lot of office buildings. It shut down to the public, I believe, in like 2015, and he was only delivering the stuff from his grocery store to other local restaurants, and eventually, when he passed away is when it shut down, but it is now a luxury Rolex building. This is the community back a long time ago in the early 1900s for Cinco de Mayo. You can see, right, how everyone is close to the celebration, and not only was this a very common for Cinco de Mayo, but it was also common for other Mexican celebrations too. So, as the Dia de la Independencia and such, and Navidad. This is the original El Phoenix restaurant. Now the location has moved about a block or two away, but you can see, right, the old hairstyles, the type of picture and clothes, just how different the community was back then. And I know that this is the picture of the family, but I know there's a bigger picture with like the community members celebrating how long it was standing for a while. This is the Pike Park. Again, there's another celebration with the Bailarines de Folclórico. Again, that's where most of the celebrations were for the community. And then the Santos Rodriguez statue is there, but again, it was recently added. And now you can see on the right for you guys how like it's surrounded by a bunch of buildings, it's barely used, and I don't even think the workers go down there to do anything because right, their lunch may be inside because all their cafes and stuff are within their own building. So the significance. Before Uptown, there was a culturally enriched, walkable, and charming neighborhood known as Little Mexico. The negative effects of the neighborhood and this revitalization to improve the community has completely erased the cultural fabric and the community that had labeled Little Mexico, Little Mexico. Revitalization of the neighborhood is gentrification in disguise. Little Mexico and its residents have been erased from Dallas, and some of them even killed, because we know that gentrification doesn't mean that everyone finds a new home to their new place. So gentrification is modern genocide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Cecile. Next, we have, and we're good on time, that was 4 minutes to spare. Dr. Angela Mack. Welcome, Dr. Mack.
Keeping everybody in suspense as I get ready. Hold on. All right, greetings everyone. Good morning. I want to invite you this morning with my presentation. I'm going to go on a journey as I examine the ways Black folks have been interpreted in states of flux and ongoing notions of perpetual flight as a result of being caught up or caught in natural disasters. I specifically examine the notion of migration in this structuring and this inscribing meaning upon Black people and Black bodies from the 2005 Hurricane Katrina, one of the 5 deadliest hurricanes to ever hit the United States. Katrina is the costliest hurricane ever recorded with over $108 billion in damages, and it surpasses the 1992 Hurricane Andrew as the costliest. And she was responsible for nearly 1,900 deaths overall. Katrina strengthened to a Category 5 storm in the Gulf Coast and made landfall the second time as a Category 3 hurricane that impacted the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. Hurricane Katrina was indeed a natural disaster, but her impact was exacerbated by neglected infrastructure to where the storm surge ruptured New Orleans levee systems and resulted in the breach that left over 80% of the city's underwater, the 80% of the city underwater, with a failure of 50 levees broken. This is a cursory examination about that storm and its catastrophe, my distillations of these collective ruminations about it, but also this is my attempt to make it make sense after all these years, even in my current mood as an Afro-pessimist. As I begin my presentation, I do so by paying homage to the people of the Wichita and the affiliated tribes whose ancestral lands Fort Worth and TCU are built upon. Their ancient love and care for the hallowed grounds in which Fort Worth and TCU are on is the reason why our university can even be successful. I honor the 150 unnamed African American enslaved ancestors whose forced plantation labor was foundational to the formation of Fort Worth when it began as an army outpost. I honor Charles Thorpe, of whom I recently discovered was an enslaved African American man whose labor was foundational to the formation of TCU. And finally, I dedicate each endeavor that I pursue and undertake, including this presentation, to the memory of my father, the late David Hemphill Sr. He remains in my heart and in my life as the strongest and most courageous person I know. I go forward in the magnitude of his love for me as his baby girl and as one who carries in the legacy of his warrior spirit. So, why Hurricane Katrina, y'all? Why do I examine this hurricane, this event, this kind of moment, this cataclysmic occurrence, almost 19 years after it happened? Well, first, I'm trying to figure out what's going on the slides.
We just want to make sure.
Okay, well, first, it's because the events of Hurricane Katrina, like so much of the research I take up, is personal for me. Those who know me know that I love New Orleans. It's one of my favorite places in the entire world. But it's not just because it's an enchanting and beautiful city. My late father-in-law, Mr. Milton Mack, he was a NOLA homeboy, born and raised, and a lot of my father-in-law's relatives still live in the city today. Second, my father-in-law's mom, the late Marion Mack, along with several of my relatives, they had to be evacuated in the aftermath of Katrina. I remember my husband and I panicked because our family members were scattered and bussed all across several states, none of which any of my family members had any ties to, and we had a very difficult time trying to discover the locations of our loved ones because they were sent in places that we had no idea where they were, and we were having issues with phone service and emergency access. Third, I remember the disaster relief efforts the state of Texas took up in helping to shelter individuals who had to evacuate. I witnessed how, depending on the city, determined the type of response incoming individuals received. Witnessing what my loved ones had gone through and watching and learning what other folks had endured never left me. It has remained with me all of these years later. So when I was finally given the opportunity, I wanted to explore what stood out to me about the narratives constructed around Black people who had to flee Katrina's aftermath, and how those narratives, those definitive and interpretive structures, have seemingly remained fixed and often unchallenged in public memory. From that time since, I believe Black people continue to be structured in similar ways when impacted by natural disasters. With that, I take into account the geographies, the rhetorics, the compositions imbued upon Black people impacted by Hurricane Katrina, and for the sake of this presentation, I focus my examination specifically on New Orleans, though I recognize that there were Black folks and just other folks in general that were impacted over the region. So, in my examination, I am treating Hurricane Katrina as a site of Black dispossession and disaster. I'm thinking about her as a site that frames geography, migration, visuality, and states of distress and displacement as configurations of Black ephemerality. From the geographic lens, I rely on Catherine McKittrick to push against traditionally held beliefs that geography, that space, that place, waters, and landscapes are inherently neutral and objective. Romanticized versions of mapping the world obscure Enlightenment's Eurocentric, white hierarchical inscriptions of conquest and colonization that narrativize the ways we have come to understand our view of planet Earth. Geography, instead, is inherently subjective, and further, it is indeed racialized. We come to understand geography through the presence or absence of people, and not simply by physical terrains alone. Racialized geography render the subjectivities, the hierarchies, the power displacements, time ruptures, and spatiality through race. The racialized are knowable and unknowable in spaces, places, waters, and landscapes. And the specifically racialized I reference here are Black folk. I pull from Catherine McKittrick, as mentioned in a previous presentation in her work Demonic Grounds, when she states, social practices create landscapes and contribute to how we organize, build, and imagine our surroundings. Black subjects are not indifferent to these practices and landscapes. Rather, they are connected to them due to crude racial sexual hierarchies and due to their often unacknowledged status as geographic beings who have a stake in the production of space. So in this sense, I look at geographies of Hurricane Katrina as a locus of Black dispossession and disaster, meaning that I view Katrina's impact on Black people as a rendering of Black life, Black death, Black history, Black futurity, Black fixity, Black mutability, and possibility in tension with Black folks being rendered as ungeographic, spaceless, and placeless. Hurricane Katrina unmaps Black people from their connectivity to New Orleans as a nexus of disaster. Katrina doesn't simply displace Black folk, but she renders them as dispossessed of any semblance of home as safe, secure, unscathed, or returnable as before, while also not accounting for her catastrophe to serve as an inverse to the ways and new locations Black people found as a sense of home in their ongoingness as geographic beings. I also treat Hurricane Katrina as a site of Black migration. Black people in the United States have either been forcibly moved here or often forcibly made to move. From chattel enslavement all the way up to Jim Crow's apartheid and anti-Black domestic terrorism, Black folks in our mobility are inextricably tethered to involuntary migration. Isabel Wilkerson, when referring to the Great Migration, states that the era was the first time in American history that American citizens had to flee the land of their birth just to be recognized as the citizens they had always been. I rely on that framing to complicate the ideas of citizenship because Black people fleeing Katrina were forced into a migration that rendered them more into the status of an immigrant, which implies the mobility of a foreigner than that of a citizen. Hurricane Katrina imbued upon Black people the status of not quite human / non-citizen. She rendered them as transient, perpetually diasporic, transgressive transpassers. Y'all say that 5 times, right? That were forced to migrate while many of them lost their own material identifications of their citizenship, and thus Black folks became classified as undocumented. So when I think of Hurricane Katrina as a rhetorical site, I think of her as one who shaped the interpretations of Black folks from New Orleans as resident refugees. Going back to that notion of not quite human / non-citizen, Black people were repeatedly labeled as refugees in the media as if their displacement revoked their claim to nationality. I use resident not in the sense of belonging, but I use it in the ways that is used legally in alienation. What you will see in the ways I present these images that are on the screen, you see them altered from the clarity of their original photography. I do so with 2 scholars in mind. One, I think about Christina Sharp, whose methods of annotation and redaction are taken up here, and I recalibrate them in a method I call diffusion. I diffuse the photographs from their fixed iconography of Black people in distress to divert the consumptive gaze from the fleshly voyeurism of Black suffering. Diffusion is my mechanism of intention to disrupt the visuality of Black people in pain, crisis, and trauma. 2, I lean into Deborah Walker King in my justification for manipulating images this way. She says that the constant truth about interpretations of Black pain in America is that Black people disappear while their bodies are constantly renewed as memorials to suffering and as tools for lessons benefiting systems of American acculturation. As one who uses photography as part of my storytelling practice, I chose to artistically manipulate these images so that these historical photographs can't be gobbled up. And it's also my way of being able to see the unnamed, but also honoring their dignity and their integrity as well. So what you will see is I will have images of Black people obscured, but if there's any police state or anything that else or any type of carceral entity, those pictures are not obscured on purpose. When I think of Katrina as a compositional site, I think of her as one who composed a visual milieu of Black negation as a spectacle of danger and imminent threat. When Black folks were scurrying for necessities, they'd be looting. When non-Black folks scavenged, they'd be surviving. The very languaging, the naming and labeling of black people as inherently criminal and up to no good because disaster struck was circulated in a feedback loop where the media fetishized black criminality. Social anxiety in this case brought about the National Guard and Second Amendment zealots operating under the premise, if they loot, you shoot. Black people migrating from the areas of disaster, fleeing from where the levees broke, were composed into non-spatial trespassers, unknowable and unbelongable, that transgressed the social norms of lawfulness and civility in a time of geographical disruption. Black presence in disaster became a fixed signifier of danger in the cartographic imaginary. Black people and our blackness have always been socially constructed as marked visuals of difference. But when we gone and the remnants of our lives remain, what does the gaze seek to consume then? Lo and behold, because the gaze always craves, in the aftermath of Katrina, disaster tours sprung forth with buses, stretch limos, and shuttles, all coming to see black folks in where we live and what had Katrina done, especially in the 9th and the lower 9th ward. And I speak of this because my uncle's church and his parsonage were flood damaged, and the house that's right across the street from that still had the spray paint of the X that was on there, and we found that there were photographs that were circulated, and photographs that were not permitted, that were taken without permission, that were circulated, and we eventually found them online. The debris became trauma porn for those who were hungry to see the native homelands of the not quite human non-citizen, the previous habitats before ruin and abandonment like black people used to live in a zoo. Capitalism strikes again by profiting from the destruction of black life, and individually it ended up profiting from black capital. When black people fled from the aftermath of Katrina, they didn't just leave, they also arrived. Their arrival as Katrina resident refugees who had been shown to transgress as trespassers into desperate uncivility, it recalibrated the geographies of the places they ended up in. I note here that when they were bused and flown and families were separated and children were having to be moved as unaccompanied, this is very similar to the ways in which we see migration practices and how people are treated today, especially here in the state of Texas. There were different responses to incoming buses and planes of folks depending on the city. For Houston had the Astrodome, and they made as many accommodations as they possibly could. Dallas used Reunion Arena as one of their locations, and it was depending on the social class of whether or not certain people ended up in certain locations. Fort Worth, we had Will Rogers Memorial Center and even the Wilkerson Grimes Athletic Center. But the responses were just compassionate, they weren't just even charitable, but much of how the cities responded were highly political. Houston, like I said, they took folks in. Dallas had to see where people were gonna go. But then when we think about it, that many times people in Fort Worth were treated from a paternalistic and not quite humane perspective. It wasn't that it was the case in every instance, but the story became popular here, and many believe that the tension between our Democratic mayor at the time, even though the mayor's seat is supposed to be nonpartisan, but the old money of the Republicans were in tension. Basically, it was this notion, this thought that the people who were coming from Katrina were undesirable. So what do we do with the undesirables here in Fort Worth? Black people in natural disasters are subject to the politics of their forced arrivals as much as they are of their forced migrations. Parsing through Hurricane Katrina and just the rhetorics and the compositions of black folks as migrating subjects has helped me to have a better understanding of how black presence, black absence, and movement become sites of marked unmapping in the temporalities of disaster. I believe that these sites inform the ways other racialized groups can also and have also been unmapped. I especially think about Hurricanes Maria and Harvey, how folks rendered Puerto Rican citizens as non-citizens, and even how Hurricane Harvey's media coverage was meticulously done in a way to not visualize the impact of the damage in upper-class suburban neighborhoods. Black people are rendered as irrevocable immigrants when natural disasters strike. Like with each migration movement, black people continue to prove our humanity and our citizenship. We continue to justify an ongoing need for geography, even through our detachment from its knowability. But even in this, even in my Afro-pessimistic self, What I do, I recognize that Hurricane Katrina may have inflicted her wrath, but she didn't eradicate the spirit of New Orleans Black folks who have created new geographies, new visualities, and new states of being in the diasporic afterlives of catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mack. And now, if you all will welcome Abdul Isaac.
How y'all doing today? I debated asking that question because, excuse me, I know nowadays it's hard to be good. It's hard to just feel good. So I'm glad y'all are feeling good, and I thank y'all for inviting me into this space, not only to this university, TCU, but obviously being present in this space requires me to honor those who have inherited this space and those who were indigenous to this space prior to the Western imperialist project taking hold. And so I think as I begin, let me make sure I have all my bearings with me. It's very text, okay, we'll rock with this. And so this is a bit text heavy only because, as you can see, I want us to explore the Western imperialist project and explore specifically this grand concept of abolition from my trained perspective as an Africologist, which is a discipline fundamentally that encompasses the study of Africa, but particularly it is rooted in the Afrocentric paradigm, which fundamentally means that the study of Africa happens from the African perspective. And so obviously there are a multitude of ways to study anything, but the lens through which you do it, grammar, the lens you do it through is pivotal, and that is perhaps what's most defining. And so essentially after this, let's hope that we can gain a little clarity into understanding what not only is Afrocentricity, but what is Afrocentric abolition, and also why might that be so important. And so much of my work calls upon, and in this early stage of this project, calls upon the work of Mariama Kaba, as well as Dr. Ronaldo Walcott. Mariama Kaba's text, especially, "We Do This Till We Free Us." Dr. Ronaldo Walcott has two, especially that form the basis of this project, on property, as well as the long emancipation. And essentially, right, again, to understand what this pressing need for a contemporary abolitionist theoretical and practical framework. Because again, especially in this academic space, we understand theory and we understand the importance of theory, but we also, especially, that's what this Afrocentric paradigm brings forth, theory must go hand in hand with praxis. If not, theory must be for praxis. At the end of the day, the functional aspect, so what we do with our theory is what is definitional. And so this project, especially in this early stage, but also as it hopes to develop, this project maintains that an Afrocentric abolitionist perspective is one that calls for the inclusive liberation of all African persons that have been marginalized and oppressed based on their cultural location, mental or physical ability, or their perceived locations within what I call the Eurocentrically imposed kind of stratifying social identification, especially as it refers to, especially as we understand sexuality and gender. A lot of times, gender and sexuality and sex even has become a matter of strata, and what do you identify as, versus understanding it as, we can call it this, I'm losing the word. Thank you. The spectrum. But moreover, this spectrum, we identify it as a spectrum because it's just this way of living, right? All of these things are just ways of being. And so when we again, because of this European, this Eurocentric stratifying of social identity, it becomes more of what do you identify rather than how do you live. And so I also argue that such an inclusive abolitionist framework cannot be fulfilled in its entirety in any manifestation of this global Western imperialist project. And my working definition of this Western imperialist project, this global imperialist project, is the summation of innumerable historical policies and endeavors, including any and all economic, socio-political institutions and ideologies deriving from and or contributing to European colonialism. And so Mariama Kaba especially does a lot of work in defining the socio-political and describing the socio-political as we start to parse out abolition and our approach to abolition. Abolition is a long-term project and a practice around creating the conditions that would allow for the dismantling of prisons, policing, and surveillance, and the creation of new institutions that actually work to keep us safe. It is a clear renunciation of the idea of abolition as a primarily negative project. Kaba goes on to explain that it is the envisioning of and progression toward a restructured society where we have everything we need. That would be delightful. Food, shelter, education, health, art, beauty, clean water, and more things that are foundational to our personal and community safety. And as I describe so much of this project, I am admittedly having to parse out my emotions because, again, these things are so much yearned for at a spiritual level that the lack of access to, again, everything we need from food to education, art, is a bit disappointing, but again, that is why this work is being done. Moreover, again, Kaba emphasizes the socio-political and interpersonal spheres of influence, discussing harm and harm remediation, harm specifically through this framework of remediation, understanding that where we can mitigate harm, but where harm happens in these interpersonal spheres, it's especially important to understand the significance of remediation. Abolition is not grounded in punitive justice, and it actually requires us to challenge our punitive impulses. While prioritizing healing, repair, accountability, it is a community process developed by anti-violence activists of color in particular, who wanted to create responses to violence that do what criminal punishment systems fail to do: build support and more safety for the person harmed. Figure out how the broader context was set up for this harm to happen and how that context can be changed so that this harm is less likely to happen again. Disputing the characterization of the framework of abolition as though it's an issue of individuals, but instead forcing the focus on these systemic structural issues that need to be addressed, especially in this environment of very, very almost hyper-charged rhetoric, to the point where the rhetoric and how charged it may be is often a distraction from some of the issues at hand. Again, it's important to understand that primarily we are in search of dismantling these systemic structural issues, and the interpersonal spheres are primarily arising from a lot of these systemic issues. And this orientation, this framework, is rooted in an African-centered communal consciousness and this understanding of an anti-colonial and a global Pan-Africanist framework. And so especially to this notion of Africans, and when I say Africans, it is also to understand the diasporic essence of Africa as a peoples. And so, admittedly a bit interchangeably, but I refer to the notion of an international community, of an international peoples, regardless of geography, regardless of time that is separated, we are African nonetheless. And so understanding this notion, especially in this geography, living under the very heavy hand of the specter and the presence of Western imperialism, especially on these lands, as has been referred to in past presentations here today and yesterday, even this idea of the person, non-person. And especially that arises from the fact that this same machination that founded and funded itself via kidnapping, trafficking, and exploitation of Africans has and will never, maybe it is a bit of that Afro-pessimist incorporation, but it will never be able to consider Africans as full humans because this machination requires, right, that lack thereof, or it requires that perspective of these people are not people, even that sentence, right? These people are not people. And so this also arises in this concept of emancipation that I'll revisit later, but Dr. Walcott speaks on the fact that recognizing the slave was a sentient being who had to be subordinated into their status also required rules, laws, and etiquette for such subjection to be maintained, and for it to appear normal and natural. Possession had to be something more than ownership. So it also became authority invested in white people to direct all inferiors. This meant that even when a white person did not actually own slaves, he or she still possessed authority over black people, whether enslaved or not. And historian Stephanie E. Jones Rogers also speaks to this as it continues, and this idea continues on into the present, showing us, speaking on how contract law and management systems that were created and developed to manage the rights of slave owners and non-slave owners also produced social practices whereby white people came to see themselves as having management. That word right there also understands and it informs not just capitalism as a work requirement in these things, but again, how these concepts permeate our everyday life, where white people came to see themselves having management and regulatory power over all black people. Mariama Kaba illustrates a primary example of this perverse psychosocial perception of the African as a kind of property, in her discussion of Celia, which I would like to preface is a story about sexual violence. And so I won't get into the details especially, but this case, this idea of Celia, who was a person, and Celia herself was a repeated victim of sexual assault from her male European enslaver. Celia, who after being unable to convince the man's daughters to intervene on her behalf, killed her abuser to prevent yet another violent encounter. Just in this, again, as it happens, Celia was a woman from the 1800s. As I look at this, I think of Marissa Alexander from Florida and so many other countless examples of Celia. Despite a state law permitting a woman to use deadly force to prevent sexual abuse, the statute did not apply to her as an enslaved person, and it was found that Celia was property, not a person. However, while Celia was not considered a person under the law and therefore could not be sexually assaulted, she did have enough agency, supposedly, to be judged a murderess and to be punished for her act of resistance. She was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. So this very convoluted notion that you are not enough of a person to have rights, but you are enough of a person to be held accountable for your own actions is where Kaba also calls it, having no selves to defend. And especially that concept of having no self to defend survives on, especially for Africans from the center, through a institutional, and by institutional I mean whether the institution of current policing, including mental health counseling, and a lot of these things, a lot of these institutions have an acronym called NHI, referring to the victim. And if this victim, again, is African and femocenter, they will use this acronym to indicate that, there was no human involved, there was no victim. And so I know I'm coming up on time, so let's see. And so, and so it's very important again to understand, and this is where I call upon the work of Dr. Catherine McKittrick, that the plantation has not gone away, but has rather been diffused, shaping innumerable aspects of modern life. One of the most significant ideas to flow from the plantation is this logic of possession and how it extends all the way from property to various cultural practices, and who possesses the power and authority in all manner of social relations in our culture. Dr. Walcott also speaks to how modern policing in the Americas was created to police the property that was black flesh, and the degree to which these ideas, again, have diffused into broader social philosophies, the idea of white deputization, working to police black people in all manner of ways, especially in the West, from modes of speech, dress, attitudes to suspicion, threat, and assumed danger, and this widespread deputization resulting in a near omnipresent police presence. My mind in that instance also goes to the use of ring cameras and what we know about a lot of this surveillance technology and the spread of surveillance technology that may not necessarily be promoted as initially intending to surveil, but we know what it is truly intending to do. The majority of policing is directed towards transgressions and against private and public property, and in vigilantly protecting property, police too often aggressively seek out those who offend, or those they might worry about offending, or those they worry might be offending, excuse me. And this preemptive, this worry about who might be offending is how we is how we get the continued lynching of Africans, whether, especially Corin Gaines, Rakia Boyd, Breonna Taylor, and Eric Garner, that idea of the presumption. And so not just does this white deputization occur through this policing in so many ways, but especially it takes place with movement. And especially how humans and how blacks up and when, the movement of Africans, especially highlighting the confines of emancipation. And so, as I come up on time, I do want to address the socioeconomics of emancipation. And so to understand the current socioeconomics, it is important to understand the layers of socioeconomics of enslavement in the past. And that's where I call upon the work of historian Eric Williams, who notes that the socioeconomic benefits of enslavement were multi-tiered. Obviously, there's that primary tier of the direct profits from the transactions of Africans, as well as the profits from raw materials harvested, whether it's sugar, cotton, and the byproducts, and the local hubs that those create. So the hubs that are, the buildings and the infrastructure that's required to turn that sugar into, that sugar cane into rum, into molasses. Those manufacturing organizations that don't exist and that the Africans don't have access to, as well as the industries that support that network, building the ships, the personnel required to transport clothing and food. And I want to close with the praxis of care. And ultimately, Mariama Kaba speaks to the importance of care and collectivity. That is where we can begin in understanding how we can work to dismantling some of these grand ideas and concepts that are working to suppress us, and where abolition may start. Care and collectivity. Care requires us to focus on the collective, and to focus on the collective requires us to care in a certain way that is not just theory, but is very practical. And so, in the interest of time, I will stop there because I will emphasize again, care and collectivity as we move forward in the interpersonal, when we understand what we can do to address, to interrogate these structures. What does it do for our ability to care for the collective? Thank you.
Thank you. And our final panelist, Suzanne Nemo. Can you speak from here?
Hello? Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna, can you hear me? Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm gonna sit while I talk. I don't have slides, so let's get into it. Yes, my name is Suzanne Nemo. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Texas at Austin, and to increase visual accessibility for any blind or visually impaired attendees, I will describe my physical appearance. I am a Black person sitting in an armchair. I am wearing a light green sweater and a black and white gingham dress and a red KN95 face mask. Thank you to the conference organizers and our lovely moderator for giving us the opportunity to share our work and learn together. So I'm going to share a dissertation chapter in progress, tentatively titled Imagine Kinship on Caribbean Plantations, Literary Depictions of Black Feminist Care. My dissertation looks at labor, family, and spirituality on 20th century sugarcane plantations in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. My research examines how Black workers in sugarcane fields or domestic workers in the home work with the natural environment to foster community healing. I explore the racialized and gendered use of herbal medicine, community gardening, and spiritual ritual in the exploitative plantation system to theorize Black ecological survival. I conduct archival research, listening and analyzing to the Radio Haiti activist Haitian radio show archive, and I also studied literature as archive. In this chapter, I look to understand Black ecological relationships through Black feminist care, specifically through Black mothering. I argue reading Black ecologies through Black mothering illuminates the role of the environment in creating kinship ties. My understanding of the queer and subversive nature of Black mothering draws from Alexis Pauline Gumbs' revolutionary mothering. And within geography, I think alongside Pavithra Vasudevan and Sarah Smith, who analyze mothering as part of domestic geopolitics. Vasudevan and Smith see domestic work in the intimate scale as Black women's refusal of their assigned disposability. In my research, I also think through Black ecologies. Shante Reese and Simone Johnson position Black ecologies as an environmentalism attentive to Black experiences and the role of power. They see Black ecologies as structured by ongoing violence and reimagine care in the context of state abandonment. In my work, I look at the plantation as a structure of violence that shapes Black environmental experiences, as well as state violence through empire and genocide. I use literary analysis to read Black ecologies through Black mothering. I think alongside Omaseki Tinsley, Bedora Lagra, and Deborah Thomas, in understanding Caribbean literature as archive and Black radical possibility. And I draw from Sammy Schultz's methods of literary analysis for understanding the liberatory possibilities of Black feminist eco-imagination. I read Black feminist novels published around the 21st millennium to understand, or 21st century, to understand the enduring influence of Black feminist care in Black ecologies. So now I'm going to discuss one novel that I analyzed in my dissertation and share a few passages for us to think through together. The novel is Urzuli's Skirt by Anna Marie Lara, which centers spirituality, sapphic love, and chosen family against the setting that Lara calls Dominican urbanization. The novel is organized into 3 parts. The first 2 parts alternate focus on Miriam and Micaela, with the final third centering on their family together with their spiritual daughter, Yalidad. The novel focuses on Black women and their romantic and platonic love through tragedy, following them from living on sugarcane plantations in the Dominican Republic, to Santo Domingo, the urban capital, to their perilous and tragic migration on a small boat, or a yola, to Puerto Rico, where they were sex trafficked, to their escape and final return home to their plantation community. When they return to the communities, they encounter a young Black girl who they mentor, care for, and become her other mothers. This relationship, this example of mothering, is the most compelling to me as I argue it allows us to understand the relationships between Black ecologies and mothering and care. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to read through some quotes from the novel for us to think through. This first passage is one of the protagonist's mother, Miriam's mother, giving birth to her. The laboring mother is a Haitian immigrant who goes into labor while working in sugarcane fields. cutting the cane with a machete. The woman turned to Marie as she stepped up to Chabelle and placed her hands on her feet. "Chabelle, I will help you." Marie called to one of the children to get water and set about assisting with the birth. The woman held Chabelle's head and arms as she thrashed about in the cane. They spoke prayers under their breath. Marie rubbed Chabelle's stomach, pushing down against the child that slowly emerged from its warm depths. Send the children to gather some leaves from that guanabana tree on the other side of the field, and some palo blanco too. Now hurry. A flutter of movement surrounded Chabelle as children ran to collect herbs from the open fields. Woman prayed all around her. So this instance happens early on in the novel and frames the role of the natural environment and community care and mothering. This is the literal birth of one of the protagonists, and it becomes a community event. The women assisting with her birth are likely mothers themselves, who then recruit their children in the gathering of herbs. The children know which herbs to gather upon instruction, which allows us to infer that their mothers have taught them the healing power of the environment as part of their community care routine. So this next passage is the relationship I mentioned earlier of Miriam, Michaela, who are the protagonist couple of the novel, and their spiritual daughter, Yalidad. In this scene, Michaela is nursing Yalidad through her menstrual cramps and is introducing Yalidad to herbal medicine in the plantation community where they live. Michaela took Yalidad by the hand and led her outside to where the herbs grow. The two women stopped just in front of the Colmados porch, where there was a large area filled with black earth and herbs. Slowly, the two circled the herb garden. Michaela pulled leaves off a small plant. She held it under Yalidad's nose. "Smell this, it's basil. And it should always be planted in front of your house, in the corner, not next to the mint, but at the other end." Michaela led Yalidad to the other corner of the house. A small spiky plant reached up for them. "Do you know what this one is?" "That's aloe." "Good. Do you know what it's used for?" "For burns?" "That's correct. This plant is special. It has over 10 uses, for inside and outside the body. You can even make syrup out of it for a cough. When you feel better, I will show you how to make it." They walked into the small canuco behind the colmado. Yalidad listened eagerly as Michaela continued talking. She studied the leaves of the plants, looking to see how they were shaped. From time to time, Michaela held something under her nose for her to smell. We can read the healing capacity of Black ecologies in this passage through the mother and daughter relationships. Michaela nurses Yalidad with herbs from her garden, and they deepen their relationships as Michaela teaches Yalidad medicine. And after years of growing together as a family, this final passage I'm about to read is the death of Miriam and Michaela, and Yalidad's response to seeing her mother's peaceful bodies. Miriam and Michaela had shown her in their final moment, had shown her with every story that had graced her ear and every medicine they had taught her. They had shown her how to walk, how to breathe, and how to believe. They had shown her the depths of love. She stared at the two figures lying peacefully on the bed. As her breath warmed the room, the sweet smell of their flesh stung her nostrils. Yalidad reached down to the ground for the keys, her body filled with a new sense of belonging. Without looking back, she left their room to go search for the medicines of their burial. These mother-daughter relationships show us the importance of Black ecologies in building community. These interactions I analyzed take place on plantation settings where Black people were confined, yet Black people created intimate relationships with the land and with each other. Black ecologies are sites where kinship is created, which is also mostly queer inclusive. They are sites of community building and knowledge creation. So thank you for listening with me and learning with me, and I'd like to acknowledge funding from the American Association of University Women's American Dissertation Fellowship and the Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowship, and the UT Graduate School for supporting my research. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. Okay. So we're gonna move into Q&A, and I just wanted to first just say that I wrote down maybe a couple of words from what all of you said, just kind of, if I could pick like a word or phrase that stuck out. So for Cecile, it was erasure. With Dr. Mack, it was displacement and invisibility, and it made me think of recognition, but also personhood, and how you kept referring to Katrina as her. For Abdul, it was how do you live versus how do you identify, and that abolition means rebuilding after you tear it down. And for Suzanne, care and continuation. That's what I heard throughout your talks. So I want to open up with a question of continuity, and any of you can respond first. But how do you see an embrace of personhood of the environment and geography as personhood, and how that helps us build a better future?
Hey y'all. How do we embody personhood in the continuity of the geography that we are in? Is what I got, right? Did I understand it right?
I say it again, sorry.
No, I was repeating your question. It was like...
Yes, so how does viewing the environment or geography as a person, as a living entity, help us build better futures?
I believe when we recognize the geography for what it is and what it is being woven into can really, really help us, because not only does it allow us to see the people who habitat it as humans, but we could also learn how to cohabitat and learn and to respect one another, especially because, like I said, that little Mexico, although I didn't personify it to be like an actual person, we can all see it that way, right? Especially because then it had to transform into Oak Cliff to the south. We saw the map, it's pretty far. And especially because it just had to transform into something that was more palpable, I think I said it right. And so if we are able to recognize and properly respect and wove into what Little Mexico is, or what it will be one day, because we're taking it back. Hopefully, right? We're taking Texas, it's not Texas, it's Texas. We're taking it all back. But anyways, we will be able to just really respect it. Again, I guess is just the geography of it. And then not only that, really fully embrace it too, because although Little Mexico existed, I am sure that there were some things that were not celebrated as authentically as they possibly could because of Juan Crow, Mexican lynching, so on and so forth. So that's my opinion, at least for my time.
Yeah, thank you.
The reason why I personified Katrina as her, because I got that from those who went through the experience, and I also I lean towards Patricia Smith, Blood Dazzler. It's a collection of poetry where she actually went through and voiced several voices of those who lost their lives in Katrina, and she gave them closure. And so the ways in which I describe Katrina as a person, and specifically as a woman, is because of the ways in which those who lived through the experience, they always described her as her. Like interacting, it was really interesting how storms are named, and so often catastrophes ended up through the people who endure them. They see them as like a personality, like they put particular attributes to it. And so the ways in which my family members and the ways in which those who I know lived through the experience of Hurricane Katrina, I've never not known Katrina as a her. I've never, from their perspective. And so my inclusion of using her in that way and giving her that personification in many ways is to honor them, is to make sure I'm paying homage to the ways in which they went through that experience. But it's also to recognize the ways in which we move through and we gender even the forces of nature. You know, we continue to see these lenses of the ways in which we put particular attributes on how we interact, survive, or live through particular catastrophes or disaster. So that's the way I see it.
And I'll just add, when Katrina hit, I was a grad student in social work in Michigan and worked for a nonprofit, and they were literally called the Katrina refugees. And I remember how we would talk about how this hurricane that displaced all these black people had the blackest name of a hurricane I've ever heard of. And we, you know, I didn't have the language then, I was like a baby grad student. But what it meant for this devastating black woman to displace all these black people. Thank you. Abdul, anything you want to add, or Suzanne, anything you want to add?
I'll say for myself, to be succinct, I think that the separation of human as a species, as yet another biological species on this earth, the separation between humans and the rest of nature, the rest of this earth, I think is a result of primarily, especially from my understanding, primarily the northern and southern cradles from the work of Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop in understanding essentially what it does to the cultural beliefs of a people when you first exist in an environment in which you kind of consider nature, not just you consider nature very integral into your life and also beneficial in a climate, especially the Nile Delta and those regions, versus as humans migrated further north and you start to face a lot more hostile conditions. And so I think that has permeated, and again, because of that African spiritual consideration of the earth in terms of the approach, it was very much an approach of stewardship in that we care for this earth. And that's where libations, offerings, and just that sense of as we take, because this is here for our benefit, but we should not abuse this, as we take, we also seek to replenish. And I think that is the crux of the African spiritual and cultural perspective toward the environment. And again, as migrations happened and as cultural beliefs differed, and you have the European culture descending from that, I think that very much shifts into we work against nature, or nature is for us to use and eventually abuse. And so I think ultimately just understanding that, I mean, even outside of just those culturally rooted notions, fully just understanding we are here as stewards, and we are here to share, and as that goes on from not just our perspective toward the earth and other species, but also towards ourselves and other humans, I ultimately think that, yeah, that kind of approach, that steward, that reciprocal approach, that harmonious approach that comes from, you know, again, to pull in African spirituality from Kemet and from Ma'at. And so this, yeah, there's very much an undertone in African spirituality of stewardship and of reciprocity and harmony and balance. And so I think I carrying that forward is how we can, carry that project forward.
As Suzanne gets ready, whoever has a question, raise your hand. I'll make my way back. Hey, White.
Oh, yeah. I just want to build off what Abdul said. I was thinking similarly. I think of Black ecologies as a part of the subdiscipline of Black geographies, and how, I think about the interdependence of people and land, and fighting the extractive nature, especially on plantations with monoculture, stripping the land of its nutrients, displacing other species from the ecosystems, and how for centuries Black people, enslaved people, have had little gardens or plots as on plantation sites to come for their own sustenance, and also this reciprocal relationship with the land that combats the extractive monoculture. So the diversification of crops leads to a more healthy soil, and it also gives food for Black people to eat who have no other options on the plantation. Yeah, I'm thinking through like a all-species post-humanist relationship with land and non-human animals, through ecology.
Thank you. And so I'm going to let you give your question, and then I'm going to run over there and let you give your question, and then if we can limit responses to maybe a minute, and then that'll help us to get a bunch of questions in.
Okay, yeah. Well, considering that, then you can feel free not to answer this, because I think that several of you were starting to answer it already in your last answers. But across all four of the presentations, right, you're all talking about displacement and diaspora in some kind of way, but I also, at least I was reading you all as really putting that in tension in different kinds of ways with relationality as a kind of practice, right? And I don't want this to be a comment that isn't a question. But I couldn't quite put a question. I just put like displacement, diaspora, and an arrow like in between it, going in both directions with relationality. And that's my question, if it's a question.
Oh, sure.
Yes, the question is, one causes the other, and forward and backwards. Like I said, it is Texas, not Texas. So we all know what that means. White supremacy has colonized, and now we call this the United States. But it is Texas, and we will decolonize one day. But not only that, the Mexican Revolution had caused Mexican citizens to go to Dallas. And we have settled in what was, I didn't say this in the presentation, but it was actually a Jewish town before Little Mexico, but then white flight happened, and so forth and so on. And now we have Oak Cliff, and now where will Oak Cliff go if Bishop Arts eats us? So one causes another, and it's so crazy that it's causing numerous ripple effects. So I believe that is what your question was, like referring to, how it's so crazy how we talked about so many movements, and within a span of like maybe 200 years. And you know, the United States is pretty young, so that's like the 2/3 of its lifetime. So yeah.
To the point about relationality, I will say that I think that is kind of the intention, and that is kind of my personal undercurrent. And I will say, I think that is what pulls me back from the personal darknesses and the depths of, obviously, even the moments of extreme Afro-pessimism in myself. And I think I remember as you were presenting yesterday, you even spoke to kind of that idea of hope, and that idea of hope being very hard. And so I will say quickly with an anecdote, I think I woke up maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago, very, very sad, just sad. And I would say also, you know, shout out to being a baby graduate student now. I think just, it was the first time, the difference with that day was it was the first time where I kind of realized that it was a weird kind of health. The sadness was out of relationality. And I was sad because I was feeling the connections to Plaza, to what's going on here, to what's about to happen over the next 4 months, 5 months. And so it was just, and I think that was the first moment where I was able to kind of use that sadness, not use that sadness, but be okay with it. And understand that ultimately it was a sadness that was out of relationality. And if there was a kind of sadness that I was okay with feeling, it was a sadness that arose from, again, sharing and empathy and understanding the global plight. And as it comes to migrations and different populations, that we can also see the shared plights, and what a lot of our revolutionary minds from over the past decades, ultimately my perspective, lost their lives because they started to build that relationality across different populations, transcending race, ethnicity, a lot of these, again, strata that are imposed, and understanding us as humans, we have a lot more relationality than, again, this white supremacy, this hegemony will make us believe.
We're gonna get one more in. And I have two. The first one is super quick though, and it is for Cecile. I think the work that you're doing is vitally important. Not only they, the powers that be, didn't want these communities to exist a century ago. That's why they were erased, but we're also in a time period now where the documentation and the knowledge of their existence, they don't want that to exist either. So I'm curious what your future is for this work, because it's really important, and I hope you continue with it.
Yeah, I am gonna go to grad school eventually and doctoral school, so if y'all wanna give me money so I can pay for that, that would be cool. Even if it's like for lunch, you know, I had to ask, you know, since everyone's so supportive. It's like, it takes a community, y'all, it takes a village to raise a child, and I'm only a 24-year-old teenage girl. But anyways, yes, I will do Into Little Mexico. I actually posted this presentation and recorded it on my YouTube channel as well for anybody who wasn't able to attend. And then not to mention too, I am doing more gentrification stuff with Deep Ellum. I have always been in love with Deep Ellum, and I will do something similar, and hopefully I can submit it as a paper for next year's conference for this one. Just a lot of that type of stuff, and especially the gentrification in Mexico City, because that's where I'm from. Just all sorts of things. So again, if y'all want to support me, subscribe to my YouTube channel so I can get some shmoney played in the background while y'all cleaning something. It's broke hours out here, y'all. But thank you so much.
And my second question is for Abdul, but it actually, like specifically, but it could be for the whole panel if we have time. And I'm specifically asking this from the perspective of the current genocide in Palestine, like the current wave just since October. So I have a friend who, in her abolition work, I should say they, not in this state, but she has really been leaning a lot towards anarchy as like an ideological framework, like a very philosophical framework, and I've been inundated with it. She's just sent it to me a lot. I hesitate to use that, but at the same time, I can't deny that these very big systemic overthrows have always required violence. So I kind of get stuck with, where does anarchy as an ideology fit within abolition work? So again, if you want to answer that specifically, if you do, if not, where do you see more of some of the tangible frameworks of how to do abolition work? And again, that could be for the whole panel, but you brought it up, so I was interested in your perspective.
All right. So I would say that I am informed by just my general approach toward violence and violent means. I will say I observe through a lens of a quote what a college professor had. White people have a monopoly on violence. And so I use that as an initial just, okay, how am I feeling about violence in terms of, okay, and just that. And then on top of that, I will say that what is essential is, it's kind of broad, so it's more of like as we think about it. What is essential is the interpersonal. And so in those moments of where we understand we are at war and violence might be necessary, how are we still organizing and unifying amongst us as quote unquote comrades? And then also, and finally, I will say moreover, and that's where I heavily lean on the work of Mariama Kaba in understanding that even through whatever destruction and dismantling may be necessary, again, we see what they are capable and willing to do to us, and so we cannot fool ourselves into understanding that, we can do certain things to alleviate that. I think it was Fred Hampton, understanding that our enemy has no conscience, so we cannot appeal to their conscience in trying to achieve victory. And so, again, Mariama Kaba, through that destruction, again, what are we still rebuilding? And so, as much as we might know the path to that just speaks to how much more energy we need to give mentally and on the forefront to the planning and the organizing in terms of what we rebuild after. And Mariama Kaba, the practice through that, she speaks to, again, letter writing campaigns, freeing Black mothers in prisons, and so there are also practical things to do, but when it comes to violence, yeah, that is a very loaded concept, and it's, I guess to say, violence with care.
All right, we're gonna squeeze in one more. I know, Cecilia, we're gonna squeeze in one more.
I just have a comment, I promise. What is it, I know it's like, okay, what are we as activists all gonna do, and we have to overthrow like the violent oppressor? Just for reiteration and reminder, homelessness is an act of violence. Homelessness is an act of violence because why do we not have food, clean water? Why are we being charged at the grocery store? So why they just have reframed what violence is, because they're like, oh, you stole from a grocery store, like arrested, goodbye. But actually we're practicing human rights. So if anything, we should celebrate that person who stole from the grocery store to feed their family. And so although nonprofit work, right, some of them is troublesome, but feeding one another and bringing community, and even if it's not a nonprofit, the Brown Berets of Dallas-Fort Worth have been very, very dedicated to the community, and there is no documentation of it. And now why is that? There's only documentation from us. And so we're not, people paint us as malicious, but it's actually not, and we're just giving food to the homeless. So I just wanted to reiterate that before I go into more of my answers.
So my question is for actually Cecile, because I'm from Dallas, I'm from DeSoto, and I went to Carter High School. I just wanted to ask you a question, because I really am for, you know, there being, like, taking it back. Like, I love your aspect and, like, that whole ideal. The only thing is that, do you think there's a way to cohabitate with the Black communities that have been founded within South Dallas? Because my family has been there for generations.
Yes.
Yeah.
But like, yes, it is possible. Especially because I believe with one another, we have seen with, I don't know who was Palestine, but someone mentioned Palestine. Palestine, there's a lot of papers of how Palestine and Chicano displacement and everything is very similar, and in the same way with the African American community, or these specific countries right within the African continent. So I feel like there has to be maybe some type of program, because unfortunately our oppressors have made us pin like against one another, when in reality we should be besties. So yeah.
And we are at 10:55. We went over a smidgen. Mix and mingle with the panel and give them a hand. Thank you all so much.